in chapter 3, we will be discussing the idea of cells. Cells are the smallest unit of life. There's a few different definitions of cells, but I think what I'd like to get into is just get into what cells are, give you some examples, talk about what they're structurally comprised of. I will say that they are the smallest unit at which living things are able to be defined as living things. Cells are capable of doing everything that a larger organism can do. They have all of the abilities to, for example, replicate under the correct conditions. They will replicate and metabolize and use energy and produce waste products. And so in many ways, cells are kind of like mini organisms of their own accord. Generally speaking, they won't live on their own, though. They will be living as part of us, for example. But there's certainly unicellular organisms out there. So here we have a really cool picture that shows many different types of cells in our body. And I want to dwell on this for just a moment because years ago I had a situation where I was talking about neurons. These guys right here, neurons. And I don't know, I was going on and on about this and the dendrites and the axons and all the different parts of the neuron. And a student went to the science help desk, whatever the tutor was at that time at that particular school. And the tutor came to me later and said, I don't think this student knows what a cell is. And I thought, oh dear, that's really, we really need to define cells. That's very, very important. All of the structures that you see here before you are, in fact, cells, other than this guy right here, the erythrocyte, also known as the red blood cell. Technically, this is not a cell. This is probably the one cell, if I were to ask you for an example of a cell, probably the most common answer that I get is the red blood cell. And ironically, this is the one cell of the body that isn't really a cell because it does not have a nucleus. It does not have organelles. It's simply a little bag, a little membrane with a bunch of hemoglobin inside of it. Its job is to carry around oxygen and to transport carbon dioxide too, and that's about all that it does. And it does not have cellular functions the way all the other cells that we're looking at here do. So when this textbook portrays cells, and I try to do it myself as well, when you draw a cell, you should always at least draw a nucleus inside of there, just so you're keeping in mind, okay, this has a nucleus. Some of the structures actually have multiple nuclei, such as the skeletal muscle cell. But you'll also always see at least one nucleus. I guess not always, but generally speaking, we try to include it just to give you, the idea that no matter what it looks like, the neuron doesn't really look like a cell, does it? The neuron does, however, have a nucleus. It has a whole bunch of organelles inside of there. And yes, it has all of these fibers coming off of itself, which all have purposes, which we will talk about. But it is a cell. Like at its basis, it's a cell. And you could tell that because especially right here in the cell body or the soma of the cell, it has a nucleus and it has organelles and all the other stuff. So what we're doing in this first set of videos here, this first day of lecturing on the cells, is we're only going to be discussing the plasma membrane. And it probably seems like overkill to you, but in fact, it's really important to fully understand the plasma membrane because it turns out that a lot of the functions that happen in our body happen at the plasma membrane. So it's actually really super important to understand the plasma membrane and understand how things are transported in and out of the plasma membrane, understand what it's comprised of, so that moving forward, when we talk, quickly about, voltage-gated potassium channels, these are these proteins that are embedded in the plasma membrane. Well, at the very least, you'll know what the plasma membrane is, and you'll have a general idea of what these things are. We'll have it like a starting point to start from. So, we're going to be really, focusing on the cells, on the plasma membrane here for this first day's lecture. So as you can see here, cells will vary greatly in their size, shape, and function. They're comprised of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. All cells have the same basic parts and some common functions. And a generalized human cell contains the plasma membrane, the cytoplasm, and the nucleus.